On this channel, I almost always give a movie some points just for being different. Not today, though. On some level, you have to respect a director with a vision who pushes against the prevailing winds to make something unique, who fights for his or her vision. With Popeye, I wish that Altman hadn't done that. I wish he'd paid more attention to the winds and turned the ship around, never left port at all. As I watched this movie, I found myself asking again and again, how did this happen? Honestly, I'm not sure I can give you a great review of this movie because it is still living rent-free inside my head, but I'll try. I do think there are some interesting things about it. I do think there are some decent ideas in it. I'll try to cast this movie in as favorable light as I can. You can see me struggle. Before, eventually, I'm forced to talk about some of the fatal flaws with it. Of course, I'll give it a rating on the Tobin rating system. The personnel of Popeye will probably catch your eye. That's what caught my eye. I guess that's why I watched the movie. It was directed by Robert Altman. It came out in 1980, and it stars Robin Williams as Popeye. Shelley Duvall plays Olive Oyl. If you're not familiar with Popeye, you might not know that olive oil is his romantic interest. It's not a bottle of olive oil. Apparently, the film was originally going to be directed by John Schlesinger, starring Dustin Hoffman and Lily Tomlin. I like those actors, but I don't know how they would have fared in Popeye. So I guess we dodged a bullet there, but only to be immediately hit by another bullet. In full disclosure, I'm not really a big fan of Robin Williams, never have been. I know he's one of the most popular, most liked actors out there, but I don't know. His humor never quite did it for me. I'll talk more about his take on Popeye in a second. This was one of his earliest movies, although he was already fairly widely known from television. I'm also not really a big fan of Shelley Duvall. It is interesting, though, that this movie came out the same year that The Shining did. I guess she was fairly busy. I generally am a fan of Robert Altman, although I need to go back and revisit some of his movies, since most of them I watched when I was but a child, and I'm not sure I would feel exactly the same way now. It might go without saying, but Popeye the movie is an adaptation of Popeye the cartoon, or it might be more accurate to say it's an adaptation of Thimble Theater, the cartoon. When I say cartoon, I mean the kind in a newspaper. That's the newspaper. It's black and white, red all over. Popeye has, of course, been adapted into all kinds of other formats, but primarily newspaper cartoon. And you can still find Popeye in your newspaper today. Actually, I don't know. I don't personally believe in paper. There are even apparently new Popeye cartoons still being drawn for Sundays, although I'm not sure about the quality. I looked at one online, and what's the opposite of laughing? I did that. Popeye first appeared in 1929. Thimble Theater had already been going for a decade, I think. The character is almost 100 years old. Even though he may have already been past his prime in the 1980s, he would have been a household name. Today, I'm not so sure. I suspect the average member of Gen Z has no idea who Popeye is. I'm no Popeye expert, so take my opinions about this movie with a grain of salt, I guess. The question that probably comes to your mind is, how do you go about adapting a short-form comic strip into a movie? This movie is just under 2 hours, by the way, which is, about 2 hours too long. Of course, today, people are adapting comics all over the place, but these are mainly comic books, not comic strips. So there are stories to go along with them. There's all kind of lore. I don't like that word, but I said it. When it comes to Popeye, we know he eats spinach, but that's kind of it. Altman tries to overcome this issue in a very Altman-esque way by making a movie with a loose plot that is more of a tableau of the characters and situations of Sweet Haven. That's the town where Popeye lives, sort of. In fact, they actually built a real town in Malta for filming. They built it much beyond what was actually needed for the shots. And the so-called Popeye Village is still there today. Of course, this movie went way over budget, and Altman seems to have maybe overextended himself a bit on the production, which may have been one of the reasons they didn't work much at all in the 1980s. Yep, it's the classic story of the death of the American O Tour. Kind of sad, but also you wonder about this man's ego, especially when he turns out a movie like this. In some ways, Popeye is not so different from a movie like Nashville, in the structure at least. Of course, Nashville is good, at least I liked it. Beyond this basic structure, though, I think the defining thing about Popeye is that it is a movie that is deeply interested in form. For instance, it's clear that Robin Williams put a lot of effort into choreographing his movement, along with some of his stunt doubles, I guess. He incorporates a bunch of poses that are straight off the comic strip page. This is kind of cool. And I think one of the main sources of both intrigue and comedy in this movie is simply seeing what everything is going to look like in live action. There's a brawl in a bar at one point, for instance, and as we sort of edge closer to the conflict, we start to wonder, what is this fighting going to look like? It turns out to be pretty goofy. We don't have Kapow and Bam, but we have, again, all these poses that sort of mimic the comic strip. So I would say this is an extremely cartoony live action movie, which maybe that goes without saying. But like I said, that's probably the sort of the primary logic and the defining sort of stylistic characteristic of the movie. Of course, this 1980, this is a while ago when it came to comic book adaptations. There weren't a lot of them. I guess the Superman movie had come out. Of course, Superman had been on television as well. But this was, again, long before the Marvels and DC days that we are experiencing now. The movie that came to mind most for me while I was watching Popeye actually has nothing to do with comics, really. It was the Lego movie. That might not seem similar at all, but that's another movie that is really interested in similitude, really interested in mimicking some other format. And part of the joy of the movie, part of the intrigue of the movie, part of the dynamo of the movie is seeing how are they going to pull this off? How are they going to turn this into a film, right? Bringing the logic and images of the toy onto the screen, that's one of the charming parts of the movie, to see how the film mimics play, the Lego movie, that is. And the Lego movie, of course, is another film that is based on a very narratively minimalist source. In theory, the Popeye movie should also be endearing, just like the Lego movie. And I think there are hints of charm. I think that the movie departs sharply from reality and from the logic of most movies, and I kind of like that. I like that it has its own sort of dramatic logic. It reminds me a little bit of some more vaudevillian films like Playtime by Tati or Delicatessen. Those are vaudevillian films where they sort of teach you a new logic from the beginning. It's clear you're not really in reality and you're not really in this traditional dramatic space. Something else is going to happen, like seeing a circus show. This movie sort of does that, but I didn't really start to grasp the intuitive mechanics of the movie until the very end. The style also isn't quite as alluring, where Delicatessen and Playtime are really, driven by this extremely sort of cool, interesting style. Popeye is sort of the opposite. There is clearly an auteurist thread in this movie. I already mentioned that the production seemed to fit that storyline. You can see it in the movie, too. This movie would be very different if not for some strong creative opinions. Of course, probably it would be better. The main word that I would use to describe Popeye is, quite simply, weird. Again, I tend to like weird movies, but not this one. Where the materiality of the Lego movie is playful and fun, Popeye is uncanny. Actually, maybe that's the main word I'd use to describe the movie, uncanny. This is the most uncanny movie I've ever seen, and I can't think of anything that comes close to it. I think the movie really jumps the shark the first time that Popeye takes off his jacket and we see his arms. Unfortunately, this happens about 5 minutes into the movie. Robin Williams wears cartoonish prosthetic arms in the film, and like I said, they are uncanny. I've shown pictures of these arms to a number of my friends, and everybody's reaction is the same, which is, ew, I don't want to look at this. Now imagine having to look at this for the whole movie. Why did they do this? I don't know. Maybe to some people this is all playful absurdism, but like I said, I just didn't like to look at it. I don't like it. I don't know. Another conspicuous part of the movie is the dialogue. In the cartoons, Popeye has somewhat distinct speech patterns. It's not obvious what to do about this in the movie. Robin Williams does a pretty good job of adopting the lingo, though he adds a bunch of isks to places, and it's, I don't know, kind of playful and kind of endearing. But something that maybe wasn't such a great choice is that everybody in this movie mumbles. If you think Woody Allen mumbles too much, just wait till you watch Popeye. Again, this feels quite weird and has a negative impact on the viewing experience. It's just kind of undramatic. There are a number of good jokes in this movie. A lot of the humor is physical, but there are also some funny lines. The dialogue, though, is delivered so strangely that you might not even notice when a punchline comes your way. In some ways, this feels like the apex of 1970s understatement, but maybe, I don't know, it feels more like a comedy sketch that was improvised by amateurs. I guess I wouldn't be against seeing Robin Williams do his Popeye impression on The Tonight Show for 2 minutes, but having it go on for 2 hours, I don't know, man. It also doesn't help the audio situation that a lot of the audio seems like it was re-recorded, ADR'd, and they just don't quite get the spatial characteristics of the sound right. It sounds artificial. Another really odd thing about this movie, I can't believe I haven't mentioned this yet, but a really odd thing about this movie is that it's a musical. Why? I don't know. The music was composed by Harry Nilsson. True fans of the channel might know that I have reviewed another Harry Nilsson musical called The Point, one of my least popular videos. That's a great movie, though, with great music. I like Harry Nilsson, Me and My Arrow. What a lovely song. I think that's what it's called. I don't like the music here, though. The songs are mumbled, just like everything else. They don't move the plot forward. If you took them out of the movie, would you miss anything? I'm not sure. At first, it's kind of interesting to see everybody singing. There is sort of this playful and absurdist angle to it that you can kind of get behind, but it gets old really fast. I guess the music might be subjective. Maybe you would like it, but if so, it's probably because you got really quirky taste. I suspect that most people would not really be on board with it at all. I guess you could see all three of those things I just mentioned, again, as being fun, as being quirks, as being something interesting. Maybe the movie is supposed to be a bit ludicrous. I mean, it is Popeye, after all. I think the thing that really just holds everything back isn't those things exactly. It's simply that the movie just sucks to watch. Partly, I guess this is because it is uncanny and weird, and it is because of these things I mentioned, but it's also just because the plot is single ply. The movie is slow, very little happens. A significant portion of the film is just Popeye wandering around and mumbling. I'm really not exaggerating this. Like the opening scene, Popeye roads into Sweet Haven. We get some music about Sweet Haven. He has an encounter with a tax collector that's, kind of amusing. And then he just sort of wanders around the town for literally like 10 minutes. I remember looking at the timer on the movie and thinking, is something going to happen? And then I realized, oh, Robert Altman. Wander around Sweet Haven with Popeye. Now, to be fair, there is some nice stuff in here. There's some good choreography. There's some good slapstick in this opening scene, but it really just doesn't seem like a movie in some ways. I don't know. There's a few plot points here and there, but they're so predictable. It's almost to the point of farce. I mean, maybe, again, that is the idea. I'm honestly not really sure how an audience is most likely to engage with this movie, or how they're supposed to engage with the movie. I read an interview with Altman about this movie, and he said, audiences want to be spoon-fed everything. Think outside the box. Use your own brain. Appreciate stuff. Look, I'm with you, man. I would love to. I think I'm in the target demographic for this movie, but I could not get behind it. The tone is so strange that I really had a hard time reading the movie. Altman in that interview said that this was one of his most widely viewed films. Even though it's considered a failure, it was one of his most widely viewed films because so many kids watched it. Apparently, he wanted to make it enjoyable for kids as well. That never crossed my mind when I was watching it. I guess it makes sense, I guess. His own grandson actually plays Popeye's adopted child, Sweet Pea. A child maybe would get something out of this movie, maybe more than I. I'm not really sure. Anyway, I've seen a lot of movies, and I've seen a lot of out there movies. This is still one of the most mystifying things I've ever seen. To be clear, it's not the most out there movie I've ever seen. Those movies I tend to like, but this is just a mystifying film. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to rant. Like I said, I'm worried that I can't give you something actually interesting here or objective or whatever. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that I do think is kind of interesting, which is how Popeye actually fits into American history and American culture. One question that kind of gets at this is whether the film is to some degree satirizing the cartoon I think it probably is to some extent. If you look at the olive oil character, for instance, you'll see a damsel in distress. She has some brief moments of spunk, but she is mainly flustered and helpless. I guess that's sort of the Shelley Duvall special. I think even in 1980, though, this would have been somewhat conspicuous. I don't want to try to shoehorn this movie into today's perspective. I guess Shelley Duvall was pretty helpless in The Shining as well. She seems to reuse some of the same facial expression, but still, it feels conspicuous just how helpless her character is here. Like maybe bordering on some sort of, not exactly satire, but maybe something that shouldn't be taken exactly at face value. I think you could describe Popeye as an Americana film, but what is its relationship with the source material exactly? That's not as clear. And what should our relationship with the source material be? What does Popeye the cartoon represent? It's old, for one thing. It's about a strong guy, working class. He's an immigrant of unknown origin, I guess. I haven't read enough of the original cartoon to really give you a good thesis here, but I think it's worth thinking about this if you watch the movie. What exactly does the original cartoon represent in our culture? I don't think this movie is openly undermining or satirizing Popeye. Altman's films, they tend to steer way clear of moralism, but maybe there is some edge to it. Altman does tend to show sort of griminess at face value in some way, and maybe part of the underside of Popeye is on display too, I guess. In some ways, this really feels like a 1970s movie, but I think it's worth considering the year, 1980, the beginning of the Reagan era, the end of cinema. How were views on traditional life shifting? What would Ronald Reagan have thought about Popeye? I mean, practically he is Popeye in some ways. I don't know. It may be subconscious, but I think this film grapples with traditional America in some way. Anyway, I would really like to be a fan of Popeye, but I'm afraid I can't do that. In terms of rating, I don't see how it's possible to give it anything higher than a 16. And frankly, I wouldn't recommend that you watch this unless you're really into quirky movies, because this is that. And it's possible that I've exaggerated just how bad this is. This movie struck a nerve for me, certainly. I did not enjoy it. But I don't know. Like I said, you got to respect the guy trying to make something interesting, I guess. So that's Popeye. If you've seen this, if you were around at the time, let me know what you think of this movie. I'm curious if I missed something. But look, this movie's rated 5.3 on IMDb. No surprises as to why that is. No surprise whatsoever.